Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia, for that presentation. We saw the slide there about the percentages of disputes, so doping, team selection, carding. What about the other disputes? What happens when an NSO asks an athlete to centralize and they're not happy about it? What happens if an athlete isn't happy with their coaching or other staff people? Those can be issues that flow out of the athlete agreement. And a few years ago, our sports solution clinicians identified to us on the board that they were dealing with more and more disputes that were flowing out of the athlete agreement. So any of you at Forum last year will have heard from our clinicians about a project that we undertook. And what we decided to do as the board is to prepare a scholarly article examining the issue of athlete agreements in Canada. And we've been working on it for over a year and a half now. We tried to have it finished for this forum. We've put in over 100 hours probably of legal and academic analysis. Altogether, it's been myself and Dasha and Professor Hilary Finley from the University of Brock and Ashley. And we will be launching the paper in October 2015, so in a few weeks. We just need to put in a few more hours to fine-tune the arguments. But what I'd like to do today is share a summary of the paper. So a summary of our findings, and then I think the best way is to share 3 case studies with all of you. So if we go to the next slide here, please. What we found in our analysis were 7 issues. And before that, we found that the athlete agreement really started off as a document that Sport Canada was asking NSOs to have their athletes sign in order for them to receive carding. And that sounds reasonable, right? It's a mechanism that ensures that in exchange for carding, athletes are actually training and competing. What happened since the 80s when that was introduced is that these athlete agreements have, in some cases, morphed into full-fledged commercial contracts of over 100 pages in some cases. And what we found in these ever complex, everly increasingly complex situations, number one is that negotiation doesn't usually happen. And that disadvantages athletes in the process. It causes athletes to increasingly give away rights. And even further, when something does go wrong in an athlete agreement dispute, we learned in our analysis that the remedies are often inadequate. The Athlete Assistance Program is the main hammer for the athlete agreement. That's usually why athletes are signing their athlete agreements, so that they can get carding. But NSOs then have an opportunity to tack on additional obligations, which can be a problem if there's no negotiation. The athlete agreement is one agreement that athletes are asked to enter into. So agreements with your NSO, with your multi-sport organization. So when you're heading to the Parapan or Pan Am Games, you have to sign a contract with TO 2015. And then there are sponsorship agreements. So we learned that athletes can be managing maybe up to 6 or 7 legal obligations, legal relationships all at one time, and that can be hard to manage. And then lastly, we learned that commercial and image rights are an important aspect of athlete agreements and a source of many of the disputes. So in analyzing, you want to switch? In analyzing those issues that emerged, we learned about case studies. So we drew from the case files of the Sports Solution Legal Clinic, and we used anonymous case studies to illustrate some of the hurdles that athletes were pushing up against. And we also looked to the published decisions of the SCRCC. So I'm going to share 3 of those with you today that fit into those seven issues that we learned about. And we have case studies under all of the issues. I don't want to spoil the 50-page scholarly article that's coming out soon. so I'll only do 3. Oh, if we go back, please. I mean, we can all read this in the French version as well. And I mean, really, what the scenario was is that an athlete rep tried to negotiate the protection of image rights. The NSO delayed the negotiation process. Athletes needed carding, and in the end, the athletes just signed and gave away rights that they didn't want to give away. So this is a problem that we analyzed. We didn't have a solution to this one yet. Another scenario from our Sports Solution case files was when a top ranked athlete was asked to centralize. A top ranked athlete in an individual sport was asked to centralize, to leave their training location, to leave their support system, and to even leave their personal coach in order to centralize with the national team against their will. And we see this as a problem. We also recognize, of course, that centralization can be necessary in team sports, and it could even be necessary in individual sports. But what we're trying to hammer in our scholarly article is for all parties involved to really consider the potential personal costs to centralization, especially when it's used as a blanket obligation in an athlete agreement. And then we also we studied one of the most dramatic breakdowns and public breakdowns of an athlete agreement relationship in Canadian sport. And this is a published decision of the STRCC. It's called Hooper and Canadian Soccer Association, if you want to look for it in the jurisprudence database on STRCC. And what happened here was 3 members of the women's soccer team, the entire team was asked to come to a 3-month-long training camp. And the only details that the team was given was an email with a couple bullet points saying how much the athletes would need to pay. You know, there were no details about what the training schedule would be, no details about what the living arrangements or food arrangements would be. And 3 of the athletes on the team decided that they wanted to take collective action. And they believed that they had actually organized the entire team not to attend. And they were wrong. At the last minute, they learned that it was only 3 of them who weren't going to attend. And it's a long and emotional dispute, but in the end, those 3 athletes unilaterally chose not to show up to the training camp, and they were kicked off the team because they violated their athlete agreement. So this is another problem that we identified, that around remedies not being inadequate. Is the nuclear option the best option when something like this happens? So out of our analysis, we came up with 4 recommendations that are going to be the focus of our scholarly article. And you know, these recommendations, we hope, are something very solid that athletes can go back to when they're trying to negotiate their own athlete agreements. So, and when they're trying to negotiate at all. So that's the first hurdle, right? An athlete is given an athlete agreement and they need to say, NSO, may I please negotiate this? I don't agree with everything in here. And the NSO's response might be whatever, right? It might be no, sorry, there's not enough time, or no, that's not something that we do in Canadian sport. We're hoping that this document serves as a reference point for athletes, saying this is a best practice that Athletes Can is recommending. Athletes Can is recommending that to increase performance system-wide and reduce disputes, athlete agreements should be negotiated. And that's number 3 that I'm starting with, facilitate negotiation. And our recommendation there is that individuals be allowed to negotiate, but also as a best practice that all athlete agreements be vetted, be approved by an athlete council before they go to individual athletes to sign. And so that's one of the goals coming out of this scholarly article. It's something that we're going to have to build towards. The other recommendation is to separate commercial obligations and performance ones, and this is to try and eliminate disputes, especially with higher profile athletes who can secure individual sponsorships. And it might not affect every athlete, but we believe that it'll affect a significant number of athletes in the system. develop meaningful secondary obligations. So that's fancy legal speak for saying when something happens in an agreement, when something is not respected in an agreement, a secondary obligation is what happens next. And so instead of going to the nuclear option and saying that an athlete is off a team when they don't live up to something in their agreement, can we as a community of athletes and as a sports system come up with meaningful secondary obligations? And an example actually in the scholarly article is if an athlete breaks their code of conduct and speaks about someone disrespectfully within their NSO, does that mean that they're off the team? And there was an SDRCC decision on a scenario like that where the SDRCC held that a more appropriate response in a situation like that is an apology letter and a small fine. And so we're looking for ways like that where the reaction in a dispute can be more reasonable and less nuclear. And the last solution that we're recommending is to have annotated athlete agreements. So an agreement that's explained in plain language that athletes can refer to when they're trying to negotiate their own athlete agreements. And that's next on our agenda after this article is released. So let's have the next slide, please. And our other next steps are to create a preamble that we'd like to recommend be included in all athlete agreements. And it's going to be flowery language, right? It's going to be about respecting the relationship and building a high-performance relationship rather than a relationship of administrative control. And we feel that this will be positive. We're looking to build a database of successfully negotiated athlete agreements, a private database within Athletes Can, where athletes who have been successful in negotiations can share their successes with us that we can make available to other athlete leaders. And a guiding principles document, and then a template for a notice of a violation of an athlete agreement that can be sent out. So we're incredibly thrilled to be releasing this document. It's rigorous and it's going to be solid, and it's the beginning of trying to engage the issue of athlete agreements, which are a significant source of disputes in Canada. So it's my pleasure to share that with all of you. Thank you very much. And we have a poll. Do you feel your athlete agreement is athlete-centered? Yes or no? Disregarding my presentation, do you feel that your athlete agreement is athlete-centered? So does anyone have any questions for me about athlete agreements? I think we have 5 or 10 minutes. Lori.
Just wondering if you would be doing a knowledge translation on that article so that it is also available in plain language and a much shorter document that we can easy to share with the athletes as well as the promoter.
Yes, great question, and we will have an executive summary which accomplishes just that.
The athlete agreement paper, so being familiar with it, I know it has a lot of great recommendations and everything, but we may be challenged as athlete reps to get our NSOs to agree with all of them. So in the event that happens, should we as a collective focus on a certain area such that we can continually kind of check off the list as a collective versus each trying to pick what we can get?
And a part of this process, we've already been meeting with our sport partners on the podium, Canadian Olympic Committee, Canadian Paralympic Committee, and what we heard from them is that separating the commercial obligations from the performance ones will probably be the easiest goal to achieve, and it's a goal that all of our performance partners are supporting 100%. So I'd say that's the easy, low-hanging fruit, and we should go after that first. And our second priority is to try and get as many agreements negotiated as possible.
One thing that wasn't mentioned yet, I know I read it in our review one, but the date of when your athlete agreement starts and when your obligations end, and if you have any obligations in there that are continuing in perpetuity, such as and stuff, something that maybe you should be aware of, not only for right
Great point. Dasha?
If your sport does not yet have an athlete council or commission, and you mentioned that
Yes.
we're talking about potentially having council approval, can you just talk a little bit to how the article will be accessible to someone who's not considering perhaps such intricate?
Right. So athletes can recommend athlete councils as a gold standard and a best practice, but we know that not every sport has an athlete council. And in that situation with the athlete agreement, what we say should happen in the interim as an athlete council is being built is that a majority of the athletes who are going to be asked to sign an agreement should approve it. Or a group of athlete leaders, a group of champions within the sport should be asked to approve it. So we recognize that formal approval is the best practice and the gold standard, but informal approval is almost as good. Thank you, Dasha. Any other questions? Des questions en français? Bon, merci beaucoup.